What's going on, everyone? My name's Eric, and today on the channel I'm going to be showing you all the basics of soldering electronics on your guitar here. The guitar that we're going to be working on today is a 2015 Made in America Dean from Hell. This is one of 100. You have all seen this on the channel before. And now this guitar has a bit of an issue, as you can see here. This volume pot is wired to the bridge pickup, and it is actually seized on the inside. Now, off camera, I took it apart and everything, and it is just kind of done, which is a shame, but sometimes that just happens with electronics. So I figured I would take this opportunity to show you all the basics of soldering. This isn't going to be a full in-depth walkthrough of different wiring combinations for different pickups and things like that. This is the basics to get you started, which is pretty well going to carry you all through any sort of soldering or electronic installs that you are going to be doing on your electric guitar. Without further ado, let's get this on the bench and get to soldering. Alright, so the only things that you're going to need for soldering your electronics in an electric guitar are going to be a soldering iron right here. You're going to need some solder paste. That is going to help when you're using existing wire and you want to have a clean contact to the new solder point. You're going to have some solder lead, and if you need to extend any wire or if you have to solder any more connections, you're going to need a little bit of extra wire there. All this stuff can be found super duper cheap. You can find a lot of this stuff like on different guitar websites, whether that's StewMac or things like that, or you can actually go pick a lot of the stuff up at local hardware stores, Canadian Tire if you're in Canada, or like Walmart and things like that. A lot of those stores are going to get you on the right track for this. One thing to be very clear of, I have 22 gauge wire here. That is pretty well the standard for guitars and just general guitar electronics. If you're going to be working on amplifiers or if you're going to be working on speakers and guitar cabinets and things like that, you're going to want to use heavy duty wire, maybe something around 12 or 10 gauge wire. But the thinner stuff like 22 gauge or 24 gauge wire for electric guitars is going to be perfectly fine. And some final recommendations before we get started here. Make sure you have a ton of airflow. I got a few fans going on. I have some windows open and things like that. You just don't want to be inhaling all this stuff all the time, and especially if you're soldering and working in like a really small environment where there's not a lot of airflow, you really want to maximize all that stuff because you don't want to be ingesting that all the time. If you want to take it a step further, wear a mask, and I do that as an extra precaution because I don't want to be ingesting all those fumes that come with solder. Even though everything with soldering is safe and things like that, there's no lead in any of the solder lead that you're going to be using and things like that. I like just to be extra sure that I'm going to be safe when I'm doing that, and I just recommend you all do that as well. And the final thing to be mindful of is how hot your soldering iron is. Some soldering irons actually have a temperature gauge, so then you can see how hot, or you can actually set it to a desired temperature to solder with. And if your soldering iron isn't hot and you're going to go in and start wiring up your guitar, you're going to run into a few problems, especially around your solder connections not actually lasting or sticking, which is then going to turn into different problems on your guitar, like maybe no sound or ground loops, which are some things that can happen as a result of not having your connections wired up properly. Alright, so as I showed earlier in the video, this volume pot that's wired up to the bridge pickup has failed. The internals are seized, and I've tried everything I could to get it to move without destroying the volume pot, and it's just not going to go. So what we're going to do is take all the existing solder points from the bridge pickup and the rest of the circuit off of this volume pot and simply replace it. At this point, if you need to retrace your steps and have a visual diagram, go ahead and take a picture of your actual guitar's electronics, then reconnect the dots when you are going to install the new volume pot or when you're going to install the pickup, for example. Every guitar pickup manufacturer is going to send out wiring diagrams with the pickups that you buy from them, which is going to get you on the right track to installing pickups, as well as pretty well every guitar pickup manufacturer has those diagrams on their websites as well. And if you can't find a specific diagram that you're looking for, I'm sure you're going to be able to find it on some third-party websites as well. Another thing with taking off connections that are soldered right to the back of the volume pot, sometimes you might have to hold the soldering iron there a little bit longer just so it can actually melt the existing solder and then release the wires from the back of the volume pot. When you're going to solder onto the back of the volume pot, you're going to need a lot of heat and a lot of solder paste just to make sure the connection actually sticks. So make sure you can hold the wire down as best as you can to ensure that it is going to stick to the back of the volume pot. And sometimes when wires off of volume pots or things like that don't want to come loose, what you can do is then simply cut the wire from the volume pot or wherever it is soldered. You can then strip the wire back to expose a little bit more of the bare metal and then resolder it onto the new volume pot or the new part that you're installing on the guitar. And if you're going to install a new volume pot on a guitar or even just do some basic soldering, you need to make sure every volume pot has a ground on it. So when you're looking at it like this, or if I'm looking at it head on, it's going to be the tab that is on the right side of the volume pot. It is then going to be soldered right to the back here. Again, you're gonna need a lot of heat and you're gonna need a lot of solder paste, and you're gonna need a little bit of extra wire to make that connection happen if the tab is not long enough to be bent back and then make the connection like that. So now the soldering paste is actually gonna clean up the different contact points that you're gonna be soldering onto. It's going to ensure that you're gonna have a clean connection and that everything is going to work in the signal when it is wired up. You can also use your soldering paste as a way to clean up the end of your soldering iron. This part might be hard to see, but I'm attaching the ground wire from the pickup and it's going to the ground connection on the back of the volume potentiometer here. If you're in this kind of situation here, you're gonna need a good amount of soldering paste. So make sure you really lather up the paste there and you have a good amount of solder lead to make sure the connection is gonna be super strong. What I have in my fingers here are two ground wires that are coming from the existing tone pot and the other volume pot that's connected to the neck pickup. You can actually tie these connections up together and solder them right where they have to go. In this case, they're going right to the ground, so I'm just going to solder them right to the ground connected like that, instead of soldering to the same place 2 times. And also be mindful of the heat and the pressure that you're using, because if you're using too much heat and pressure, you could then desolder from your existing solder points already. You want to have a nice fine line between the amount of heat and the amount of pressure that you're using to solder a new connection and not desolder an existing connection. So if you're in a situation like this where you're installing a new pickup and the hot wire from the pickup is not long enough to meet the volume pot, what you can do is then take another piece of wire and then splice the 2 pieces of wire together. You're then going to solder both pieces of wire together and then use that remaining end of the new piece of wire and attach it to the new spot that you have to go to. So now at this stage in the game, what you want to do is test to make sure that your work is good. So if your guitar has the strings on, like this Dean from Hell does here, you can simply just plug it into an amp on the clean channel and the distortion side, just strum a couple chords and just, you know, test the volume pot or test the pickup if you're installing a pickup, or the input jack or something like that, just to make sure it's working. And if you don't have strings on the guitar and you need to test it in some way, what you can do is then tap the pickup with an Allen wrench or a whammy bar or something like that, tap it right on the magnet, and then test the part that you've recently installed, whether it is an output jack, whether it's a volume pot, or maybe it's a new toggle switch or anything like that. But otherwise, that's gonna do it for today's video on a little bit of an introduction into soldering to get you started. Once again, this is not a full in-depth detail of how to wire certain pickups in certain configurations or to do any sort of crazy wiring on your guitar and things like that. This was just a basic overview of how to solder and some tips and tricks that I've learned throughout my years of fixing guitars, and something that I could pass on to you to get you started, since a lot of people are asking me how to solder, especially if they want to try something new and learn a new skill. If you like this video and you learned something new, make sure you like the video and leave a comment below telling me what you've learned new, and maybe if you want to see other content like this on the channel. And if this is your first time here checking out the channel, I have tons more content like this and other covers, gear demos, and other things like that on the channel as well. Thanks for checking this out, and I'll see you next time.